Welcome to the Korea Now podcast. I'm your host Jed Lea-Henry, and on today's show we have Alon Levkowitz. Alon is the chair of the Social Science and Civics Department at Beit-Berl College, a lecturer in Asian Studies at Bar Ilan University, and a research associate at the Benin Sadat Center for Strategic Studies. And he is also an expert on the relationships between North Korea, South Korea, and the Middle East region. In the early days of the South Korean Republic, the Middle East just wasn't on their radar. It didn't have the significance for Seoul that other countries at the time were already recognizing. But as the 1970s drew around and the significant role that the Middle East could play in the world in terms of oil exports became apparent, South Korea's relationship with the region grew exponentially. And of course, this engagement from Seoul was less diplomatic or military, but rather a single-minded focus on economic growth, trade, and the prospects for South Korean firms abroad. Now, in the 1990s, South Korea's policy had to shift. It was suddenly impossible to engage in the region in pure economic terms. Middle Eastern countries were increasingly asking for economic assistance, arms imports, international alliances, and of course at this time the region was also becoming increasingly volatile. So South Korean assets on the ground suddenly represented a possible military risk back in Seoul. And indeed the countries that South Korea were trading with and were most closely aligned with were in many ways some of the most volatile. Iran, Syria, Iraq, countries that were mass exporting oil and needed infrastructure projects inside their country, also offered the greater opportunities for the South Korean government and the South Korean Chaebol, who, just as they were in South Korea, were incentivized through tax breaks, beneficial loans, and governmental incentives to invest, construct, and trade with Middle Eastern countries. On the other side of this, countries like Israel were left in the dark. They didn't need mass construction, certainly didn't need international help with their construction, and they weren't exporting large quantities of oil, for example, that South Korea needed. So throughout this, South Korea were walking a tightrope of sorts. Their policy was officially one of neutrality, one where they didn't want to get involved in regional disputes or pick a side, but from where they were increasingly being forced to put themselves in positions that would come across as detrimental to other countries in the region. And of course, the security concerns that they share with a country like Israel are not minor. Missile defense technology, or the placement of aggressive neighbors pursuing nuclear weapons, is something that both countries are on the same page with, and both are dealing with the same reality. And so when sanctions were placed on Iran, this had huge ramifications back in Seoul, not just with the economic restrictions this imposed, but also with the potential to lose allies and alienate countries like America and Israel. And of course, looming over all of this is the risks, and indeed the opportunities presented by the regional instability that was the Arab Spring, which twists our attention to North Korea. North Korea's engagement with the region was also economic, but it had a more significant focus on military development. Not just the export of arms to the Middle East, but also the import of technology of their own. The cross-pollination between chemical weapons programs in places like Syria, nuclear weapons programs in places like Iran, and missile technology across the region are all too apparent. And over the years, in the embryonic stages of some of these missile programs, and in the accidents that emerged from them, the world develops definitive proof that North Korea were involved in these programs. But of course, a lot of this twists onto Iran and the nuclear program, and the parallels between the pressure put on Iran internationally and the pressure put on North Korea, and the closeness between these two allies, and the ability for them to evade sanctions in tandem, or even develop a nuclear weapon under the guise of the other country's program, was a significant risk, and still remains so. And for a country like Israel, North Korea haven't just been someone who's been willing to engage from a distance in this regard. North Korean troops were directly involved in the conflicts in 1967 and 1973, particularly helping the Arab countries' air forces. And over the years, North Korea has trained militants and terrorists from organizations like Hezbollah and Hamas inside Pyongyang, then returning to their home countries with new skills and new tactics, such as the difficult and complex process of building tunnels. This interview with Alon is a remarkable look at the engagement between the two Koreas and the Middle Eastern region. And the detail here is absolutely fascinating. The small intricacies and the fundamentals of the research walk new ground and do so in a riveting way. Below this podcast, I am going to link Alon's articles that I used as research for this podcast, and I can't encourage listeners enough to go and read that detail. Now, as always, this podcast is entirely funded by you, the listener. And if you do want it to continue, please consider donating at the Patreon account or the PayPal link attached below. Failing that, you can either share, like, or comment on this podcast across social media. This help is greatly appreciated. On that, and to walk us through the relationship between the two Koreas and the Middle East, this is Alon Levkowitz. Alon Levkowitz. Thanks for coming on the Korea Now podcast.
Thank you for inviting me.
So we're going to try and split this up a little bit here, but of course there's going to be a lot of overlap. So there's two quite dense topics here. The relationships between South Korea and North Korea, and those relationships they have with the Middle Eastern countries across a whole range of dynamics: security, economics, trade, etc. So let's start with South Korea. And I suppose it's best to go back to the very early days of South Korea. So in those early days of the South Korean Republic, 1950s, there was very little relationship between the Middle East and South Korea as far as I could see. And a lot of what it seems to be from your research, a lot of the relationship that they did have, they tended to see the Middle East not so much as something that they could achieve something from, as something that they could gain from, but almost as a detriment.
Yeah, but before we start talking about the Middle East, would you say I agree with you? Today, I don't know when it will be broadcast, but today is July 14. When we record this interview, the Israeli president is visiting South Korea for a 1 week official visit, trying to upgrade the relation between the two countries. And in a way, if we look in the last, let's say, 70 years, there's a huge change between the relation between South Korea and the Middle East. We have to understand when we're speaking about the Middle East, some sees the Middle East just as let's say, Israel, Egypt, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, and a few more countries. But by looking at the Middle East, we should expand a little bit further to include Iran, Saudi Arabia, and even parts of North Africa. But as you mentioned, in the 50s, the relation between South Korea and the Middle East were very limited. One should understand that in those days, Korea was occupied with developing the countries. 2 years after the establishment of Korea, there was the Korean War. Some of the countries in the Middle East were asked to participate in the war. Most of them said no. One exception is Turkey, that participated in the Korean War, and Israel was asked to participate, but due to a ideological debate in Israel, who should we support? Because the left said, let's support North Korea. The right said that we should support South Korea. At the end, we decided not to participate, but to send medicine and food to South Korea. But in those days, South Korea was not an economic power that needed the Middle East for its business. They didn't need oil, gas in those days. And when we talk about Korean companies, in those years, these Korean companies such as Samsung, LG, and the well-known Chaebols did not existed, but they're not that important companies that were looking to do business beyond the Korean Peninsula. Plus, we had to add one more thing, is that in those days, we should remember, it was the Cold War. And Korea was bounded or constrained by the rules of the game of the Cold War, which means that in those days, Korea could have established diplomatic relations with the countries that belong to the Western world, countries that were pro-US in those days. And the Middle East in those days was divided between the pro-US, the pro-Soviet Union, and the non-aligned countries. So in a way, South Korea was limited to which country it could establish diplomatic relation. Later in the 50s and the beginning of the 60s, they established a diplomatic relation, but it was very limited because in those days after the war, Korea developed its economy, and later on, it reached out for the Middle East.
So focusing in on that security element there, we'll leave the economy and some of the diplomatic stuff for a little bit later on. If we drill down on that security factor here, of course, a lot of South Korea's external security concerns have been about North Korea. But as you mentioned there's been this Cold War and this American alliance over the years. So I might bring us forward a little bit here to the first Gulf War. And this was this strained moment for South Korea. South Korea had only previously sent troops abroad once to Vietnam. And then America put the pressure, as they were, on all the allies to commit troops to the first Gulf War. So I might get you to open that moment up for us there and talk about I suppose, the strains and the challenges that were presented in that moment.
Yeah, you remember. Again, I have to agree with you. The Vietnam War was a unique war because in those days, once you remember, it was under Pak Chung-hee. The South Koreans sent about 300,000 South Korean soldiers to assist the U.S. in its war against communism. It allowed South Korea to get economic assistance from the United States in those days. And the big question is why during the Gulf War, well, one should differentiate between the first Gulf War and the second Gulf War. In the first Gulf War, the United States didn't have a problem with foreign countries. One could say that they had a problem with too many countries that were willing to send forces to assist the UN forces headed by the US command. The second Gulf War, as you mentioned, was more complicated because it wasn't seen as a legitimate war. It didn't receive the support of the UN Security Council. The first war received the legitimacy from the UN Security Council, but in the second war, Washington said that it received, but not all the states agreed with Washington, and most of them didn't send forces to fight in the second Gulf War. This is why Washington increased the pressure on two Asian important countries. One is South Korea, that you said, and the second one was Japan. As Washington said, we want boots on the ground, and we don't want any excuses. And this was an important problem, or one would say even a crisis for South Korea, because if you look at South Korea's Middle East policy along the years, once it decided to, when it started to invest in the Middle East, once it started to build infrastructure project and other investments, you see that South Korea, on the one hand, defines itself in, let's say, in the last decade or two, as a middle power. While when you talk about South Korean Middle East policy, South Korea tries to have an impartial policy. In a way, we are here just to make business. We don't want to intervene in political, security, or other delicate issues. Later on, if we have time, we can talk about the Iranian issue from a South Korean perspective. Now, in the case of the second Gulf War, this was a problem for the South Korean government. How can we send a military force to the Middle East? By doing so, we're making a stand. We're supporting the U.S., which is an important ally of us. But the South Korean government was concerned that by sending military forces to the region, it might be perceived by the region state as tilting against them. And this caused a problem for them, which led to send the forces not to a military zone, as Washington wanted. B, these forces focused on infrastructure projects and not on military projects, in order to be perceived, and that's how the South Korean government was branding these forces as civilian forces that assisting the Iraqi and other people in the region, to assist them from a civilian point of view, not from a military point of view. By doing so, South Korea wanted to brand itself not as a military power, but as a civilian power that is trying to assist the region, not in order to conquer, but in order to be a partner of the Iraqi people.
And there is another factor there as well, though, isn't there? As you mentioned there, there's this tightrope that they have been trying to walk throughout these years with the American factor on one side and trying to maintain a neutrality across the region. But there's also something else that South Korea have been focused on for a while, and I suppose understandably so, and that is the designation of themselves globally as a middle power. And if you're going to stand out internationally and have this sort of impact around the world and be seen as a serious global player, then you are expected to engage in these sorts of conflicts around the world, especially when they are supported from UN mandates, for example.
Yeah, but the South Korean government, I'm not criticizing them. I'm just raising question about, and you mentioned the middle power status. If you're a middle power status, you should take a stand and sometimes pay the price. But the South Korean government is trying to play with this status. On the one hand, we are a middle power. We are an important player in the international organizations around the world, plus the regional organizations such as APEC, ASEAN Plus 3, ARF, and other regional organizations or international organization. We are trying to be an important player in the United Nations. But once we move from, let's say, from the Asian region, we are trying to be, one would say, impartial, trying to be seen just as an economic power without making a political stand. And one excellent example for sometimes the conflict that Seoul is standing between two powers is the crisis of the THAAD. If you remember, the missile defense the U.S. missile defense that was not established. What's the word? Deployed. Yes, sorry,
yeah.
Deployed. The missile the U.S. missile defense was deployed in South Korea, and the South Korean government had to make a decision: who should we tilt to, or who should we support? Should we accept what China demands, that we withdraw this missile defense system, or should we accept Washington demands to deploy the system? At the end, what South Korean government did is they deployed one system. Beijing sanctioned them for a few months. They pay the cost of these system for the South Korean economy from the Chinese sanctions was very high, billions of dollars, and this in a way portrayed the dilemma that Seoul is in. Who should we tilt to? How can we play a middle power state while at the same time focusing only on economic interest without trying to make a stand on a political or in security issues?
So as we speak through this tightrope, I might bring in another quite difficult tightrope that South Korea have been forced to try and walk in the Middle East, at least recently. And of course, this is one that many other countries have also been forced to walk. And that is with the introduction, I suppose, the onset of the Arab Spring a few years ago. And South Korea, of course, as you mentioned earlier there, and we will get into the economic issues as well in a second, have a lot of economic ties inside the Middle East themselves. So the idea of destabilization and I suppose risk not just to personnel but also to financial assets was a problem here. But of course, South Korea also were walking this line of being a country that had gone through its own democratization process not too long before this, only a few decades previously, and in some ways had sympathy, perhaps sympathy, but also had some sort of guidance it could give to a region that was trying to democratize in many ways. So that seems from the outside to be an incredibly difficult place that South Korea found themselves.
Yeah, but you mentioned democracy or promoting democracy. South Korea, if you compare South Korea to the Soviet Union or Russia nowadays, or to the United States, or for example France, South Korea tried to portray itself as a state that doesn't have any imperialist background. It doesn't have any intent to conquer the Middle East. And by doing so, it says to the Middle East states, and they see it in a positive way, that South Korea doesn't have any hidden agenda to conquer them or to influence them. We're here just to do business. And it's important that he said the issue of democracy. And at the beginning of the Arab Spring, other than the huge concern of the South Korean government that some of its projects will be conquered by militants or other guerrilla forces in the Middle East, or some of the South Korean workers in the Middle East would be hurt by the fighting, South Korea was trying to brand itself as an important democracy that is willing to assist the Middle Eastern countries to promote democracy, and they said that they're willing to assist the new government or the potential new government in the Middle Eastern states to assist them to establish a democratic institution. Plus, the government was willing to assist them in developing their economy after the Arab Spring will end. And South Korea has different agencies that can do so. For example, KOICA, or the Korean Development Institute, and other institutes that are part of for example, the South Korean Foreign Ministry that could assist the Middle East. But the question that the South Korean government had to ask itself is, are you willing to not just assist, but to make a stand in the Arab Spring? One would say that as long as the Arab Spring was not rising in the Gulf states, everyone were less concerned, because if the Arab Spring would rise in the Gulf states, this would threaten the gas and oil flow to South Korea and to Japan as well.
So let's open up that economic question then, because as you mentioned at the start of this podcast, it is the primary reason that South Korea suddenly find themselves very interested in the Middle East. And at least reading through your research here, it seems to be the case that they are focusing on the importation of Middle Eastern oil, as many countries did back in the 1960s and 70s, of course. But of course, South Korea do it a bit differently as well, as they have over the years. And that's with the Chaebol, which you've also touched on. And
yes.
So people may have an understanding of how the Chaebol existed in South Korea, these large family-owned conglomerates with government backing in many ways that get cheap loans and incentives to invest. And it seems here that this same incentive structure was given to these Chaebols to then move and not just invest, but also construct in the Middle East.
Yeah. It's very important, because during the 1960s, the beginning of the 1970s, the Park Chung-hee government was looking for investments beyond South Korea, and the Middle East was a wonderful place to invest, to build, but the biggest problem that the South Korean Chaebols, South Korean companies, was facing is that no one thought that the Korean companies can build. No, the perception. I would add, one of the biggest problems, not now, but in the past, was the perception of South Korea as a third world country that can't do anything. Some of my colleagues in the Middle East, when they go, even now when they go to visit South Korea, they say that South Korea is a third world country. And I agree with them, and I tell them, I totally agree with you. Go to South Korea, and when you come back, we'll talk again. And when they go to South Korea nowadays, they come back and they apologize and say, "Well, we thought we thought that it's a third world country, but we made a huge mistake." In those days, in the 60s, a South Korean company had a problem to convince states in the Gulf region in North Africa to allow them to build the infrastructure, huge infrastructure projects, and they received, as you said, loans, guarantees from the South Korean government, and they were able to build huge projects in states in Iran and in Libya as well, and since then the Middle East became an important place to invest, to build infrastructure projects for them. And it's not just oil and gas. Oil and gas is important, but there are billions of dollars of projects that the South Korean governments South Korean companies are building in the Gulf states. And for example, when Park Geun-hye visited Iran, after the JCPOA, after the nuclear agreement was approved, she signed potentially about more than $50 billion of projects that the South Korean companies were supposed to do in Iran, just in Iran. If you look at the trade between South Korea and Saudi Arabia, South Korea and Gulf states, it's hundreds of billions of dollars, and this shows why this region is very important. And why, for example, one of the side effects of these billions of dollars of projects of trade between South Korea and the Middle East is Israel. South Korea is still concerned that upgrading the relation between South Korea and Israel might have an effect on its economic relation with other parts of the Middle East.
So let's open up that Iranian issue there, because in your research here, I came across a fascinating, I suppose, thought experiment that might have missed a lot of people over the years. So not too long after the Iranian Islamic Republic is announced, of course, the Iran-Iraq war starts, and You've written here that South Korea and other countries waited for the day after the war, and that's a wonderful way to look at how people may look at a region like the Middle East and the turmoil on the ground. So even when you see something like the Arab Spring, people are seeing opportunities here. So after the Iran-Iraq war, countries like South Korea are seeing two countries that are desperately needing two things, both to restructure not just their militaries, of course, but to grow, but also they're going to need massive construction projects on the ground. And over the years, of course, as you mentioned earlier, this need to bring in oil has made sure that the relationship between South Korea and Iran has been as close as anything they've had in the Middle East, and it has come in, as you mentioned there as well, to the detriment of countries like Israel, simply because countries like Israel don't have the economic exports that South Korea needs.
Yeah, if you compare the trade between Israel and South Korea is about $3 billion. The potential is double, but if you look at the trade between South Korea and other states in the Middle East, for example, the Gulf states, it's more than $100 billion. So the gap is huge. Israel cannot offer what the Gulf states can offer for South Korea. But you're absolutely right. The sad thing, the sad conclusion from what you said is that a war is a bad thing, but a war is a potential for business. Well, you can sell weapons to both sides, but after the war, we need to rebuild the state. And South Korea, and later on we can talk about North Korea. South Korea saw the potential, so it was not just South Korea; it was European countries and other states waiting for the end of the war in order to invest or rebuild rebuild Iran, to rebuild, to do projects in billions of dollars in Iraq. But there's a huge risk. There's a potential, but at the same time, there's a huge risk. And once Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, some of these projects were in danger because the Gulf War started, and some of the projects that the South Korean companies built were in jeopardy.
So let's build on that Iranian question there, because it is quite a fascinating one, especially considering how things have been developed in recent years with the I suppose the nuclear agreement that Iran had with the world, and then Donald Trump and America backing out of that agreement and sanctions bouncing back onto the country here. So I have to assume here that with that P5+1 agreement that first came out, this must have been a huge economic boon for countries like South Korea. Suddenly the doors to Iran were open and they could trade in brand new ways. But I have to also assume that over the last couple of years, as Donald Trump has come in and he has changed policy on this, that must have put a considerable halt on South Korean involvement in the region.
Yeah, the South Korean were waiting in the line to see what will happen with the nuclear agreement with Iran, because Washington was pressuring everyone not to do business with Iran until they will have the agreement. Once they, if you remember, once the agreement was signed, delegations from European countries and other states traveled to Iran to sign billions of dollars of contract, and Pagone was in line, came with a huge delegation to Iran and signed contracts in billions of dollars. The South Korean media defined it as the second Middle East boom. The first Middle East boom was during her father's Pak Chung-gi era, and this was the second boom, Middle East boom, that his daughter was achieving in the Middle East. Now, from a South Korean point of view, the decision of Donald Trump to withdraw from the agreement and to increase the sanction created a huge disappointment, because the potential of trade is the potential trade between South Korea and Iran is more than $100 billion. Sorry, and the South Korean were trying to find along the years loopholes in the sanctions in order to allow them to continue the trade between South Korea and Iran. And along the years, Washington was pressuring South Korean government to increase the sanctions and not to find ways to bypass the sanction. And it created a tension between Washington and Seoul. But at the end, Trump said enough is enough, and you have to stop trading with. You have to decrease the trade between Iran and Seoul.
And there are, as you mentioned there, this risk that countries like South Korea run when they invest in the Middle East, or at least engage in the Middle East these days. It seems to be growing as well. At one point through your research here, you've referred to what has happened at least around the Syrian civil war, as a new Cold War. And there are also these other conflicts, of course, as people are aware of, such as the issue in Yemen, where, of course, Iran and Saudi Arabia are in conflict through proxies, of course, but in conflict. So it seems, and of course, as people are all too aware of, there is the issue of, there's a lot of South Korean businesses and South Korean personnel in this region. You do get this problem of returning people that may be radicalized. And there has been only one, but still one is enough, one case of one South Korean teenager who did go and join ISIS. So it's, even in this changed modern environment, South Korea still walking a very, very dangerous tightrope here.
Yeah, but South Korea, talking about this teenage, think about the Brits, or think about the French, or think about the Belgians. Thousands of people from Belgium, thousands of people from Britain, France, and other places in Europe went to Iraq, went to Afghanistan, went to Syria to fight with the governments or against the governments, to fight with ISIS or against ISIS. And if you look at the South Korean are very concerned. In the case of, you mentioned the teenager, the kid that went to Syria, it's just a one case. And so far, the South Korean, you can't find in South Korea dozens or hundreds of people making decision to immigrate or to move to Syria and to fight the war against or for these governments. But the South Korean government is very concerned that one day some of the South Koreans might decide, a few more teenagers or a few more militants in South Korea might decide to do so. Until now, they didn't do so. But the South Korean government is monitoring what's happening in the Middle East in order to assist the South Korean government, or to notify them that in some places is very dangerous. This is why, if you look what kind of businesses do South Korean companies do in Syria or Yemen, you see the trade. You look at the trade is very minimal between South Korea and Syria, or South Korea with Yemen. South Korean companies would prefer not to go to very dangerous places, although they had investments in Libya. But when the civil war started in Libya, some of them withdrew from Libya.
So let's push on to North Korea here, not to leave South Korea behind, or the Iranian or the Israeli issue, which are just too fascinating here, but because it's a good way to open up these issues as well. So if we move on to the North Korean shadow here, North Korea, of course, step into the Middle East in a very different way that South Korea do. So it has this deep history that many, many people are just not familiar with, but it also has this link between the two countries, as in the same kind of shadow that a country like Israel might feel itself living under, with as you mentioned earlier, missile defense systems and perhaps a hostile aggressor or two on its borders. This is South Korea have been living this reality as well for a while. And so I might get you to take us back to those early days with North Korea in the Middle East, and use some really odd moments here where people just are not, I'm assuming, are not that aware of these issues, these not just moments where there's been cooperation between the two countries, but moments where North Korea have actually sent troops or advisors to help countries around Israel. So in 1967 and the 1973 wars, North Korea weren't just there in terms of selling arms, but they actually had some sort of minor involvement in these two conflicts.
Yeah. If South Korea was in the Middle East for business in billions of dollars, North Korea was here supporting, from an ideological point of view, supporting the forces that are fighting imperialist forces, such as Israel is being portrayed, or such as the United States being portrayed as an imperialist forces in the region. The North Koreans were supporting Syria and Egypt in the 67 war and 1973 war. They send military forces such as pilots, North Korean pilots that fought against the Israeli pilots in these two wars. Along the years, they sent combat forces to assist the Middle East, the Arab states, to fight or deter the Israeli forces. And along the years, there's an extensive military cooperation between North Korea and the Middle East states, which raised concern from the Israeli point of view that North Korea poses on the Israeli security.
And what were North Korea? Sorry, what was the attraction of North Korea to countries like these? Was it simply because they are an ally trading with them or assisting them with them, or were countries like these countries who were buying armaments from North Korea, who I have to assume were not the most technically advanced, though they were probably old Soviet armaments as well? Were it simply the case that they couldn't attract these elsewhere, or that there were embargoes on them elsewhere? So what was the attraction from the Middle Eastern countries of North Korean help?
So if it was a multiple choice question, all the above are right. We have an ideological alliance, for example, between Kim Il-sung and Hafez al-Assad, the president of Syria. We had an ideological alliance with the non-aligned state in the Middle East. We had states that belonged to the communist bloc, and North Korea was willing to support them. The North Koreans were supporting the terrorist organizations in the region in their fighting against the state of Israel from the ideological point of view. But ideological is important, but financial issues the economy is important as well. And what the North Korean was willing to offer to states in the region is to offer, at the beginning, a light weapon, and along the years they were willing to offer missiles or other military technologies that, for example, the Soviet Union was not willing to send them, to sell them, or they couldn't get it from other sources, and the price tag that the North Korean was demanding was lower than the price tag that the Russian or the Soviet Union were willing to sell.
Sorry.
Yeah. Yeah. So, for example, we can see technological cooperation from the 80s. Some of the Soviet missiles were given from Egypt to North Korea, and what the North Korean did is reverse engineering, finding out how can they build their own missile technology. And we can see we have intelligence indication of military cooperation, technological cooperation between Syria, Iran, North Korea, and even with Egypt in developing middle range, short range, and the long range missile that the North Korean were willing to sell to anyone that was willing to buy.
So you touched on Syria then, and that is another interesting case, because as you just mentioned as well, there's so many, I suppose, intricate links here between the two countries, between the Middle East and North Korea, going back and forth. And one of them is Syria. And of course, Syria made a lot of news over the past few years, not just because of the civil war and the Arab Spring uprising, but also because of the placements and the use of, or at least the apparent use of, chemical weapons. And this is something that North Korea seems to have directly assimilated assisted them in developing?
Yeah, there's a debate in the intelligence community between researchers. Did North Korea assisted only in developing missile? And he mentioned Syria. We might talk about it in building the nuclear site in Deir el-Azur, which Israel bombarded in 2007. And the question was, did the North Korean help the Syrian regime to develop its military chemical industry? There are some indications, but it's being debated if the North Korean has assisted them or the Iranian. We know that the North Korean regime developed biological and chemical military capabilities, and they were willing to sell it to anyone who was willing to buy it without any ideological restrictions.
And I suppose it's worthwhile introducing here as well, just to cut you off there, just how we know, because you mentioned a few times that this is a difficult thing to actually nail the details down here, but you've got some fantastic details here through your research of just how it is that we can know for certain that North Korea were involved at least somehow, and that is often with the failed tests of some of these missiles. So in 2005, 2007, 2009, these tests of, I suppose, knockoffs of Scud missiles, and when they fail and people die, then suddenly it's in the accident moment that we recognize and we realize that there were North Korean casualties, for example.
Yeah, it's very. This is very sad that the best way to find out that they're cooperating is by people getting killed during a chemical experiment. And you're right that there were a few accidents that the North Koreans, Syrian, and even Iranian, and this shows us that there was an extensive cooperation between these three countries on conventional and non-conventional weapon. And as you mentioned, people died during these failed experiments, and the three countries were trying to hide it, but we found the indication for that. Another indication is you can see scientists or people that are in charge of the chemical military industry in North Korea visiting Syria. They're not visiting Syria to talk about Confucianism or a Syrian or Iranian delegation dealing with the non-conventional weapon visiting Syria or North Korea. This shows that the cooperation between these three states is very extensive, and you mentioned Syria. The big question is, when Obama increased the pressure on Syria to give up its chemical capability, the big question is, did the Syrian give up their chemical capability, or they just gave a part of it, and they still have the know-how and the technology to reestablish their chemical industry and to pose a threat on some of its citizens and pose a threat on Israel once again.
And is there any way of knowing how engaged North Korea have been throughout the Syrian civil war? So there's been a lot more, I assume there has been a lot more focus on the imports of arms to Syria throughout the, as the Syrian civil war has rumbled on. Has North Korea remained engaged? Are they still selling arms? Are they still engaged in terms of military assistance and help in this way?
They're still assisting the Syrian. Along the civil war, there were indications that they were not just selling light arms and short-range missiles. That they were sending troops to assist the Assad government, because the Assad government had the problem of finding soldiers to fight along with him. But later on, the Iranian became more involved, and the Russians sent its troops. But still, there are some indications that the North Koreans are still there assisting the Assad regime. One should remember, as you said, that a war is a potential for business. North Korea sees that once the civil war in Syria will end, there is a huge potential for selling its merchandise to Syria. The big question is of the relation between North Korea and the United States. will Trump administration say, give up your nuclear weapon and stop exporting non-conventional or even conventional weapons to the Middle East, and this would pose a problem for the North Korean regime.
So, of course, when most people speak about North Korea and the fears from North Korea, it's always nuclear weapons. So let's open up that nuclear question there. And you touched on it just briefly before, this idea that there was a fear, at least for a while there, that North Korea had in some ways built a nuclear reactor, perhaps similar to the Yongbyon reactor in Syria. So I might get you to open up that issue. How realistic was this concern, and what was it on the ground? Because at least from my understanding, Israel managed to hack into the system somehow, but correct me if I'm wrong, but there wasn't a direct attack against it?
Okay, this is an interesting question. Let me answer it by going back to 1994. Then I'll talk about 2007. In 1994, the Americans were focusing. During the 90s, the Americans were focusing on the issue of stopping the nuclear threat that North Korea posed. And in those days, Israel was trying to find ways to stop the North Korean missile exports to the Middle East. Washington was focusing on nuclear, and Israel tried to reach a deal with North Korea in those days. At the end of the day, it failed to do so. We were trying to find ways to convince the North Korean regime to stop exporting missiles to the region, and by helping them economically in a creative way. But at the end, this deal failed to be accomplished. Now, going back to 2007, there were indications that the North Korean were building some kind of a nuclear reactor in Syria. And then the Mossad, the Israeli CIA, was able to hack to one of the scientists and to get pictures of the site, of the Syrian site, nuclear site, including pictures of North Korean scientists in this in Deir el-Zur site. Now, the one who should have demolished or destroyed the site was the United States, but due to political or other constraint, Washington was not able to target the Deir el-Zur site, and Israel made a decision, because Israel is not willing to allow any Middle Eastern state to develop a nuclear capability that would threaten its existence. Israel bombarded the Deir el-Zur site, nuclear site, and Israel didn't comment, or Israel didn't publish this attack. The only state that condemned the Israeli attack was North Korea. Even the Syrian, because the Syrian didn't want anyone to find out that they were developing a nuclear capability, didn't condemn Israel. So in a way, the only state that condemned Israel was North Korea. By condemning Israel, they were saying we were helping the Syrian to develop their own nuclear capability. But I must say that despite the fact that Israel was able to provide evidence that the North Korean were assisting Syria, North Korea was not punished by the UN Security Council, because in those days there was the second summit between Nomuyon and Kim Jong-il, and other factors influenced the decision not to punish North Korea, despite the fact that it proliferate nuclear capabilities.
So let's move this on to Iran then. And of course, this is the country that most people tend to draw allusions between North Korea and Iran, simply in terms of their pursuit of nuclear weapons and the sanctions that have been put on them over the years. So as we mentioned there, and as we dug into that issue, how much of a hand, if any, has North Korea had in the development of the Iranian nuclear program?
First of all, we should differentiate between these two cases. North Korea is a nuclear state, despite the fact that Washington does not want to declare North Korea as a nuclear state. Iran is a different case. Iran has not yet developed a nuclear capability, but it has the potential of developing a nuclear capability. The North Korean case proved to us that if a state wants to develop a nuclear capability, despite the sanctions that will be imposed on her, it will be able to develop its nuclear capability, and North Korea did so in an amazing way. It developed nuclear capability, and it developed the ICBM capability, the long-range missile that can hit the United States. Along the years, there was a very extensive nuclear and missile cooperation between North Korea and Iran, in assisting both states to develop their nuclear and missile capability. So there are some differences in missiles between the Iranian and the North Korean, but one can see that they share some of the technologies and they share information between the two states. And if you look at some of the hopefully classified information, you can see North Korean delegations that are dealing with nuclear and missile capability visiting Iran along with the years, and vice versa. Iranian scientists that develop nuclear and missile capability visiting North Korea along the years, and some of them have participated in some of the missile and the nuclear tests along the years. North Korean nuclear and missile tests along the years.
And there is one incredibly fascinating part of your research here that I have to bring in when it comes to Iran and North Korea. And this is this idea, perhaps it's just a fear, that that Pyongyang was perhaps a backdoor way for Tehran to develop its own nuclear weapon. So when the nuclear agreement was up and running in full effect, of course, sanctions on Iran fell away, and there was a fear out there in the world, and I suppose perhaps realistic fear, at least in theory, that Iran could move at least some of its development of the nuclear weapon into North Korea. It could run a nuclear program inside North Korea, it could test a nuclear weapon, it could develop its nuclear advancements, its nuclear information, and move forward in this process in this way. And no one would actually have any of the wiser that it was making the progress, because all the figured would all fall on North Korea, and people would simply think it's North Korean tests and North Korean program moving forward at exactly the same time. So let's open up that incredibly, I suppose, fearful, and also perhaps, I mean, I'm not sure how much realistic evidence there was out there, but the theory behind it, it seems to have made a lot of people quite worried over the years.
Yes. One should say, thank God, it's just a theory, and it didn't work out. And it didn't work out. I asked some of the military experts in Israel about the theory, and they said, "Well, we pray to God that we wouldn't have to test this theory." And this was, from the Iranian point of view, breaching the nuclear agreement would cost them billions of dollars. The nuclear agreement allows them to get investment. Well, until Trump decided to withdraw from the agreement, but the nuclear agreement allowed them to continue to develop part of their nuclear capability. But during these 10 years, they could gain billions of dollars in trade with European countries, Asian countries, and other countries around the world. One of the biggest concerns was that Iran would not want to have to develop its nuclear capability in Iran, or to become a nuclear threshold state in Iran, because by doing so, they might endanger the nuclear agreement that they're gaining billions of dollars. This is why the backdoor plan was that Iran would continue to develop its nuclear capability, and even do another what a North Korean would do is the North Korean would do another nuclear test, 6 or 7 nuclear tests, which will allow them to get money from the Iranian. The Iranian would have paid for would pay them to do this nuclear experiment, and by doing so, Iran could become a threshold, not a threshold state, but it could become a nuclear state without declaring it, but with testing it. One would say that thanks to Trump, for now, the North Korean which Trump said Kim Jong-un is a nice guy, North Korea would not try to do so because it might cost them huge sanctions that for now they're not willing to pay it.
And of course, the focus on all of this is Israel. At least the security threat is Israel. Now, this is quite extraordinary situation. Israel have no common border. They're 8,000 kilometers away from Pyongyang, and yet they see North Korea as a very real security threat towards their country. And it's not just the direct influence on nuclear weapons or missile technology to countries like Syria or Iran, as we mentioned, but also the follow-through effect. And there's a fear here that once missiles get in the hands of the Iranian regime or the Syrian regime, then they might quickly find their way into Hezbollah in Lebanon or Hamas in the Gaza Strip. And then these organizations might be considerably more willing or more free or more open to use these types of weapons. And you also touched on another aspect of that over the years, which looks at those two organizations as well. And it is this remarkably strange relationship between the countries where when militants from Lebanon and the Palestinian territories, for example, have traveled to North Korea for training.
Yes. The North Koreans are willing to share their intelligence, their experience in guerrilla fighting, although they didn't fight any guerrilla war in the last 50 years. But they're willing to train as part of their ideological cooperation between other militant or terrorist organizations around the world that are fighting the imperialist forces or they're fighting Israel. They were willing to train them. They were willing to sell light ammunition to these organizations, Hamas and Hezbollah. Some of the shipments from North Korea moving to Iran and from Iran to Syria and to Lebanon were intercepted along the years by Israeli Air Force. But still, the North Koreans are willing to sell as part of their contribution to their economy. And military equipment is an important export for the North Korean economy.
And if we look in the same sort of mode here, the 1972 terror attack at Israel's Ben Gurion airport was one that was in some ways sponsored directly from Pyongyang.
Yeah, there's a huge debate. Was this terrorist attack? Were these terrorists trained and supported by North Korea? There are intelligence reports that supports this accusation, but it is being debated between the community. Are there real reports or not? I think that there is an important influence in the case of the 1972 of North Korean support of the terrorist attack in Ben Gurion airport in Israel.
And as we finalize the final couple of questions here, there is one aspect of this that is very particular to North Korea and particular country, or I suppose regions like Gaza Strip. And this is this tunnel building threat. So for anyone that's been to South Korea or even North Korea, has been to the demilitarized zone, there are these deep tunnels that have been built under it. Now, this is North Korean tunnels built towards the south. And the idea is you build these tunnels and they are not just attack mechanisms, but spy mechanisms and all these sorts of things. And the North Koreans built these things incredibly deep underground through incredibly hard rock. And this is also the tactic that has often been used in Gaza. So I might get to open up this question here, this tactical share and this tactical know-how between these two groups.
Yeah, one should add that it's not just from Gaza. It is from Lebanon as well. Hezbollah is using the same tactics, and you're absolutely right. If you visit the DMZ, the third tunnel, you can go down under to see how the North Korean dug these tunnels, which pose a tactical threat on the South Korean military forces beside the DMZ. the same tactic is used by Hezbollah up north, and Israel was able to reveal some of the tunnels that Hezbollah dug in the last few years, and they were able to blow them. In the case of Hamas, Israel were able to locate some of the tunnels. Some of them were blown up. Some of them were blocked by a wall that Israel is building between Israel and Gaza. In the last few years, there were indications that North Koreans are helping Hezbollah in teaching them the tactics of building tunnels, plus the tactics of building bunkers. But until now, no North Korean was caught in Lebanon or in Gaza. But there are indications that there are North Koreans in those areas assisting these terrorist organizations.
And as a final question here, a lot of North Korea's engagement in the Middle East, of course, rounds its way into Israel, regardless of where they seem to be selling arms to or who they're assisting. It comes back to Israel in a roundabout way. So I might get the last question here. Just look at Israel's options here. Of course, the military option is limited, but there is always a diplomatic option here. But of course, in some ways, as we mentioned about South Korea earlier, Israel has been at a bit of a deficit here simply because they don't have anything large or anything too significant that South Korea or perhaps even North Korea has wanted. But there has been diplomatic efforts over the years, even if they're only slight, and that is at least in the 1990s, I believe. People from Israel and the Mossad have reached out, at least in part, in some tangible ways, and tried to come close to an agreement, some way of perhaps buying North Korean cooperation, or at least economic cooperation between the two countries, to buy their friendship. And as you mentioned earlier, this seems like, at least from the outside, like a theoretical option here. If North Korea was so interested in the Middle East because they were trying to make money in hard currency, which is something they're always trying to do, if Israel have a chance to assuage some of that, then they may be able to influence the arms and the assistance in the nuclear programs in other countries.
Yeah, in those days, as I mentioned, Israel was trying to find ways, first to convince Washington to increase the pressure on North Korea to halt the missile export to the Middle East, but Washington was concerned more with the nuclear issue. Along the years, Israel was trying to convince South Korea to use its economic relations, economic trade with Iran in order to increase the leverage and increase the pressure on North Korea. But South Korea said that we don't use our economic relation as a leverage on North Korea. And he mentioned that during the 90s, beginning of the 90s, there were delegations, people from North Korea that were trying to find ways to the Israeli government. They tried to communicate with people from the Israeli Foreign Office in order to get economic assistance that they couldn't find in other places, that will enable to build an economic project in North Korea with the assistance of the Israeli government, Jewish investors in the U.S., which will allow them to gain money from this project. The Israeli government thought in those days that by doing so, the money that the North Korean government would gain from this economic project would convince them to stop selling missiles to the Middle East. To make it like a South Korean telenovela or South Korean drama, at the peak of this drama, there was a delegation from the Israeli Foreign Office trying to see what are the options, what are the possibility of this deal. And there was a delegation he mentioned from the Israeli Mossad that were checking, talking with other delegation from the North Korean government. At the end, the Mossad said that the chances of assisting economically the North Korean regime, it's not possible. What they said at the end, what would happen is that the North Korean would gain money from this economic project, but at the same time, they will continue to export missiles to the Middle East. and Israel would not gain anything from that. The American told the Israeli government, please move out from North Korea, because in a way this is our territory, and we want to pursue our policy in those days. So nowadays, Israel could not pursue this kind of project in North Korea without getting the green light from Washington. And now Washington is focusing on solving the nuclear issue and the other missile and non-conventional weapon at North Korea. And I think Trump, despite the wonderful relation between Donald Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu, they would not allow Israel to pursue a project or assist economically North Korea, and by doing so, bypassing the sanctions. So for now, this diplomatic option is not on the table.
So that is a good note to leave this on, I suppose. I always say this at the end of the podcast, and I often do that. There's more detail that we could have got to in the podcast, but on this occasion, I really, really mean it. There's so much here, so much in terms of depth and detail, and the kind of detail you're not going to find elsewhere. So I'm going to link below this podcast as much of Alon's articles and research as I can, and of course, all the ones that I use for direct research for this podcast. I encourage people to go and read it all. There's so much in there they can get their hands on here. Alon Levkowitz, thanks for coming on the Korean Eye podcast. It's been an absolute treat.
Thank you very much. It was challenging to talk to you for an hour about Korea, but thank you for inviting me to talk about this important issue.